There comes a horrifying moment in the life of every predator when they understand that the natural order has suddenly and brutally flipped. It is that brief instant of icy awareness when those who believe they hold all the power realize they have stepped straight into a snare built by death itself. Tonight, we travel deep into the choking, fog-soaked swamps of Georgia at the peak of the American Civil War, where the barrier between the living and the dead is as fragile as the mist floating over the water. In October of 1863, a band of hardened slave hunters pushed into this ancient wilderness, convinced they were chasing simple prey, never knowing they themselves were being hunted by a legend that would soon haunt their final moments. They believed they ruled this land, but they were about to confront the deadliest sniper the Union Army had ever created, a man whose name was murmured with terror around Confederate campfires. If tales of survival, poetic justice, and the sheer strength of the human spirit speak to you, make sure you hit that subscribe button now, because the story you are about to hear will strike deep into your soul. The Georgia swamp seemed to breathe with an evil life of its own that night, a hot, damp beast that felt like it was waiting for new blood. The air was thick and heavy, almost suffocating, carrying the stench of decaying plants, ancient sludge, and the sharp metallic smell of fear. Spanish moss hung from the warped arms of cypress trees like torn burial cloths of unsettled spirits, swaying softly in a breeze that offered no comfort from the heat. The moon was only a weak, pale blur behind the clouds, casting just enough dull light to reveal the dark water stretching out like a shattered mirror. 5 men pushed through this hostile terrain with the confidence of those who had never paid for their crimes. These were bounty hunters, skilled trackers who earned their bloody pay by chasing people seeking freedom and dragging them back into chains and suffering. They crossed narrow wooden paths and muddy banks with practiced steps, their boots sinking into the earth with wet, sucking sounds. To anyone watching, they appeared to be the unquestioned rulers of this cursed forest, heavily armed and overflowing with dangerous pride. But the swamp was watching, and tonight its gaze was patient and colder than the grave. At the head of this pack was Jeremiah Colt, a scarred veteran whose face looked as if it had been chiseled from stone and left to rot in harsh weather. Colt raised a rusted lantern, its weak orange flame throwing long twisting shadows that bent and warped across the trees. He had hunted humans for more than 15 years, ever since a musket ball shattered his leg during the Mexican War, leaving him with a permanent limp and a heart filled with resentment. Plantation owners from Savannah to Atlanta paid high prices for his work because Colt always delivered, no matter how cruel the methods. He was known for never losing a trail and never showing mercy to those he caught. Tonight the reward was especially tempting, and greed burned brighter in his eyes than the lantern he held. He paused near a patch of disturbed mud and spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the black water, where it vanished instantly. He glanced back at his crew with a smug grin, certain the $500 bounty was already his. Kneeling beside the muddy edge was Tommy Briggs, the youngest of the group, who looked completely out of place among these ruthless men. At just 22, Tommy still carried the gentle face of a boy who should have been working fields, not hunting families through swamps. He traced the edge of a faint footprint with his fingers, his pulse racing with excitement. "Tracks are fresh, Mr. Colt," he whispered, his voice shaking slightly from both thrill and the cold, damp air. Tommy was the son of a poor dirt farmer and had joined Colt's crew 6 months earlier when the war crushed the local economy and honest work disappeared. The older men treated him like a servant or a joke. Still, Tommy was desperate to prove he deserved their fear and respect. He checked the percussion cap on his Colt Navy revolver for the 10th time, hoping tonight he would finally use it. He had no idea that his hunger for glory was pulling him toward a darkness he would never escape. The man they were hunting that night was extremely valuable, which explained the large price on his head. Colonel Bogart Ashford, a wealthy and vicious landowner, was desperate to reclaim this runaway because he was a gifted blacksmith with rare skill. The escapee could craft everything from fine horseshoes to precise rifle barrels, making him vital to the Confederate war effort. But it was not just about lost labor. Ashford believed this blacksmith was a leader who helped others flee by forging papers and mapping paths north. Colt let out a low laugh as he watched the boy study the tracks, a sound empty of warmth or mercy. "He thinks skill will save him," Colt muttered into the darkness. "But iron and fire will not help when we snap a chain around his neck." They thought they were chasing a frightened man running blindly for his life. They never noticed the tracks were far too clear. The trail had been left on purpose, a careful path guiding them straight into hell. Behind Colt and the boy stood Marcus Webb, a man whose nerves were wearing thin like frayed rope. Webb shifted the heavy coil of hemp rope on his shoulder and wiped sweat from his brow with a shaking hand. "You sure it's only one man?" he asked, his eyes flicking toward the thick shadows along the trail. Webb was a coward by nature, drawn to a job where he could hurt others without danger. But 3 years of hunting desperate people had damaged his mind. He had seen what humans could do when trapped, and the silence of this swamp made his skin crawl. Beside him towered Pike Morrison, a massive man standing 6'4" and weighing close to 300 pounds of brutal strength. Pike mocked Webb's fear, his heavy body making the wooden planks groan beneath his boots. "It's one man, you shaking fool," Pike growled, his voice rough like grinding rock. He carried a double-barrel shotgun that looked small in his huge hands, and he had never met a runaway he could not crush with his fists alone. Trailing behind them all was the most dangerous man in the group, a quiet figure named Samuel Cross, who moved with the smooth ease of a water snake. Cross was their best tracker, a man who sharpened his deadly skills hunting Seminole warriors in the harsh Everglades of Florida. His pale eyes swallowed light instead of reflecting it, and his thin lips rarely parted unless announcing death. Unlike the others, Cross did not share their loud confidence. A chill of warning crept up his spine. The footprints they followed were calm and steady, not the wild marks of a panicked runaway. Cross had seen signs like this before during the Indian Wars, when he himself had been hunted by enemies who knew the land better. He stopped briefly, listening past the noise of his careless companions. Insects were silent in places, and birds had stopped calling, signs that a predator was near. Still, Cross kept quiet, his pride battling his instincts as they moved deeper into the fog. As they pushed farther into the maze of cypress and dark water, the mist grew thicker until it felt like smoke wrapping around them. Everything beyond the lantern glow vanished, replaced by gray haze that swallowed sound and twisted direction. Somewhere far off, a great horned owl cried out, its lonely call echoing like a funeral song across the swamp. Danger hid everywhere. Alligators slid through the floating plants, their eyes glowing like amber when light touched them. Poisonous snakes hung from low branches like living ropes, waiting for careless hands. The air throbbed with a deep, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, ancient and uncaring toward the men invading it. Suddenly, Cross froze and lifted his hand, his sharp eyes catching a faint spark in the distance. "Fire," he whispered, pointing through the trees. Maybe half a mile, burning low. Colt's eyes gleamed with hunger, the same look a shark shows when it smells blood. "Perfect," he hissed, flashing a grin that showed his stained teeth. "Is camping, thinking he's safe in this mess, poor fool." Colt dropped his voice to a rough whisper as he explained the plan. "We circle him quiet. Cut off the water. Take him alive if you can. The colonel pays more for breathing property, but kill him if he moves." The men nodded and spread out smoothly, working like a team that had done this countless times. Tommy Briggs felt a rush that made his hands tremble, while Pike Morrison cracked his knuckles, eager for violence. They moved forward, completely unaware that control had already slipped from their hands. High above them, hidden deep within the twisted limbs of an ancient oak tree, a silent pair of eyes tracked every movement below. The shape was wrapped in leaves, shadow, and patience, almost invisible against the dark, scarred bark blending fully into the swamp around him. He held a rifle unlike the common muskets carried by most men of that time, a weapon altered for brutal accuracy and long deadly reach. This man was Isaiah Freeman, known among Union soldiers only as Ghost, and he had been waiting in that position for more than an hour. Isaiah was 32 years old, a man who had broken free from slavery and reshaped himself into a force of judgment. He watched the hunters through a telescopic sight built by skilled lens makers in Massachusetts, his breathing slow, steady, and controlled. The Union Army had given him the rifle, but the swamp had shaped his spirit, and tonight he would use both to shield the innocent. The hunters thought they were closing in on an easy target, but in truth they had stepped straight into the killing ground of the most dangerous man in Georgia. The small campfire flickering in the distance was not the careless fire of a lone runaway, but a signal of survival for people who had nothing left to gamble except their lives. Gathered close to the weak flames was a family of refugees, people who had trusted a stranger with their future in return for a thin hope of freedom. Martha Washington, a name she chose for herself after fleeing the rice fields near Savannah, slowly stirred a thin soup made from dug-up roots and the final strips of dried venison. Her face showed the deep wear of 3 weeks spent running, but her eyes still burned with a fierce strength that pushed back the darkness closing in on them. She was 43 years old, a woman who had watched her first husband sold away to settle a gambling debt, and her 2 oldest children disappear into the auction yards of Charleston. This small ring of warmth was all she had left in the world, and she sat with her back to the fire, using her body to block the cold, damp mist from her remaining children. She knew they were being chased, but she did not know the hunters were already close enough to see them watching with hungry eyes. Beside her sat Samuel, her husband of 10 years, a carpenter whose large, rough hands were wrapped protectively around their teenage daughter Rebecca. Samuel was built for calm work, shaping wood, fixing fences, and building homes, yet tonight his heart slammed in his chest like a trapped animal. His eyes stayed locked on the wall of darkness beyond the firelight, his grip tightening around a rusted knife each time a twig cracked. Rebecca, only 16, had inherited her mother's quiet resolve and her father's careful watchfulness. She held a torn Bible tight against her chest, a forbidden book she had learned to read in secret by candlelight hidden beneath the floorboards of their old cabin. She dreamed of standing one day in a classroom, not as property, but as a teacher, opening young minds that had been told they were worth nothing. Tonight those dreams felt far away, smothered by the thick, wet air of the swamp and the heavy silence that pressed down on the trees. Curled close to the fire were the 2 youngest boys, David and little Thomas, both fighting sleep. David, at 12, was old enough to understand the deadly danger surrounding them, his eyes moving constantly with a seriousness no child should carry. He had seen the scars across his father's back and heard screams spill from the overseer's barn, and he knew capture meant something worse than death. 8-year-old Thomas was still protected by innocence. To him the terror of the journey felt like a grand adventure, a dark game of hide and seek. He did not understand why voices had to stay low or why they walked until their feet bled. All he knew was that the tall, quiet man guiding them, the one with the long rifle, had promised they would be safe. "Mr. Freeman won't let the bad men get us," Thomas had whispered earlier that night, a simple statement of faith that now hung heavy in the warm, damp air. High above this fragile scene, Isaiah Freeman shifted slightly on the thick branch, the rough bark pressing into his chest. He studied the family through his scope, his heart tightening with a mix of sorrow and fierce protectiveness. The fire was a tactical mistake, a danger he had allowed only because the children were beginning to shiver in the cold, wet night. Isaiah knew light drew predators, but he had judged that he could see the enemy long before they reached the family. He was more than a guide. He was a guardian armed with .58 caliber justice. His rifle, a Springfield model 1861, had been modified by Union armorers who recognized his rare gift. The barrel had been carefully rifled to keep the bullet true over long distances and the trigger tuned to the lightest touch, but the weapon itself was only a tool. The true danger lived in the man behind it. Isaiah had been born a slave on the very plantation he had just helped this family escape from, a cruel twist that gave him deep knowledge of his enemy. He was the son of a woman who died giving birth, and a father he never knew raised in the quarters to be silent, unseen, and obedient. Yet the master's son had taken a strange liking to Isaiah, treating him more like a companion than property during their youth. In secret, the young master taught him how to read, how to write, and most importantly, how to shoot. They hunted deer and wild boar in these same swamps, the master never realizing he was training the man who would one day help tear the system apart. Isaiah learned to slow his heartbeat, to read the wind by a single moving leaf, and to melt into the land itself. When the war came, he fled not to hide but to fight, joining the 54th Massachusetts, the famous colored regiment, where he proved that a black man with a rifle was equal to any soldier alive. Down in the mud, Jeremiah Colt and his hunters finally slid into position, their eyes adjusting to the faint glow of the distant fire. Colt crouched behind the wide roots of a cypress tree, peering through the darkness at the huddled shapes. He did not see a family. He saw figures on a ledger, money waiting to be claimed. "Look at them," he whispered to Pike Morrison, nodding toward the refugees, sitting there like birds on a fence. "The woman and the big man are worth $200 each, and the girl will bring a fine price in New Orleans." Colt felt no guilt, no spark of mercy for the fear they were about to unleash. To him this was business, flesh traded under the protection of Southern law. "Remember," Colt added, his voice low and rough, "leg shots, if they run, damaged ones still sell, dead ones don't." To Colt's right, Tommy Briggs felt a sick mix of thrill and nausea twisting in his gut. He tightened his grip on his revolver, thinking of his mother back on the farm, waiting for money to buy seed for spring. He told himself he was doing what was right, following the law, but the sight of the children by the fire made his palms slick with sweat. Beside him, Marcus Webb drank from his flask, the whiskey burning as it went down. Webb had stopped seeing people years ago. It was the only way he could sleep without screaming. He focused on the money, the cards, the bright lights of Savannah, and the forgetfulness gold could buy. Pike Morrison, the giant, only smiled in the dark, shifting carefully so his boots would not suck loudly from the mud. He lived for the moment of impact, the panic, the sound of bone meeting fist. Only Samuel Cross, the tracker, stayed focused on the land instead of the prize. He positioned himself to cut off any escape deeper into the swamp, his rifle steady against a mossy log. Still the hair on his neck rose. Something felt wrong. The setup was too clean, the fire too open. It felt like a trap. Cross scanned the tree line above the fire, looking for the lookout that should have been there. He saw nothing but hanging moss and shadows, yet the sense of being watched would not leave him. He tightened his grip, his eyes narrowing. "Something ain't right," he muttered. But the signal to strike was close. He pushed the feeling aside, trusting his experience and the weakness of runaways. It was a choice that would cost him everything. High in the oak, Isaiah Freeman breathed out slowly, his breath unseen in the warm night. He had marked every hunter Colt in the center, the younger one to the east, the drunk, and the giant to the west, and the tracker in the rear. It was a clean pincer move, done with skill, but ruined by pride. All their eyes were fixed forward on the ground, never once lifting upward. Isaiah adjusted his aim, the crosshairs settling over Jeremiah Colt's chest. He could see Colt's lips forming final commands. A cold calm washed over Isaiah. He was not killing from anger. He was clearing a path to freedom. He was a shield for the helpless, a blade for the just. His finger tightened gently on the trigger. The swamp seemed to pause, insects fell silent, and the ghost of the swamp made himself known. The moment stretched thin, vibrating through the heavy air until even the swamp felt ready to cry out. Jeremiah Colt lifted his scarred hand to signal the advance, his mouth opening to unleash. The violence he had planned with such care never made it past his lips. The order died in his throat, replaced by the deep, roaring crack of a rifle shot that felt powerful enough to tear the sky apart. The bullet, a thick minable moving faster than sound, slammed straight into Colt's chest with crushing force. The impact twisted his body hard, spinning him sideways as his lantern flew from his hand and splashed into the dark water, hissing like a dying spark. Colt hit the mud with a heavy, wet thud, his eyes frozen wide in shock that swallowed all pain. In that last brief moment before darkness took him, he did not see memories of his life. Instead, he understood something far worse. He was never the hunter he believed himself to be. The swamp had passed judgment, and the sentence was death. The stillness of the swamp broke instantly, replaced by noise and confusion. "What in God's name?" Pike Morrison shouted, his huge head snapping around as he tried to find where the sound had come from. The echo bounced between the cypress trees, twisting and spreading. making it impossible to tell where the shot had been fired. Before anyone could even react to their leader falling, the sharp metal click of a bolt-action rifle cut through the mist. 3 seconds later, another shot exploded through the night, clean, exact, and merciless. Tommy Briggs, a young man desperate to prove he was grown, was scrambling toward a rotten log for cover when the bullet struck him. He collapsed into the shallow water without a sound, his hopes of saving his family's farm sinking into the mud with him. The water around his body darkened as the swamp quietly accepted its second life of the night. Fear spread through the remaining men like fire poured with fuel. Marcus Webb, already shaking with nerves, completely lost control and began firing his pistol wildly into the trees above. Bright flashes lit up his position again and again, cutting through the darkness. It was a deadly mistake in a world ruled by shadows. "Show yourself, you coward!" he screamed, his voice breaking as he emptied his gun into hanging moss and empty branches. High above, Isaiah worked the rifle with calm, steady movements. His hands did not shake. He felt no anger toward the man below, only a hard sense of duty. The third shot came fast and clean, ending Webb's screams forever. Now only the giant and the tracker were left, and the swamp seemed to press closer, colder, and more alive than before. Back at the camp, the sudden burst of gunfire sent the Washington family diving to the ground. Martha threw herself over little Thomas and David, pushing their faces into the dirt to shield them from the horror. Samuel grabbed Rebecca and dragged her behind the thick trunk of a fallen cypress tree, placing his body between her and the bullets. "Stay down," he whispered harshly, his voice shaking with fear. "Don't move." They heard men shouting, crying out, and dying, mixed with the terrifying boom of the rifle, but they had no idea who was winning or losing. To them, it sounded like the end of the world had come to the Georgia backwoods. Thomas whimpered into his mother's dress, hands clamped over his ears, while David stared into the darkness, eyes wide and frozen. They could only watch and pray, trapped in a fight over their own lives. Pike Morrison had never been a man who feared much. His size had always protected him and given him power. But now, crouched low in the mud with 3 of his men dead, a deep animal terror shook his massive body. "Where are you?" he roared, pumping his shotgun with a loud metallic sound. Fueled by blind rage, he charged toward the place where he had last seen a flash of light, crashing through bushes and vines like an injured beast. He needed something to hit, something to break, something to make him feel strong again. But Isaiah Freeman was not a fighter who rushed in. He was a shadow. From above, he followed the giant's clumsy run, calmly leading his aim. The 4th shot struck true, dropping Pike in mid-step. The shotgun flew from his hands and landed uselessly in the reeds. As Pike fell, gasping and choking, his eyes drifted toward the campfire and the family huddled together. For the first time in his hard and cruel life, he did not see possessions. He saw people. And too late, he understood that he was the monster in their story. Only Samuel Cross remained. Cross was a tracker, a man who had spent his life reading the quiet signs of the land to hunt others down. Unlike the rest, he did not panic. He did not run. The moment the first shot rang out, he rolled silently behind the thick, armored trunk of a massive cypress tree. He pressed his back to the rough bark, breathing hard but forcing himself to slow his heart. Cross was a veteran of brutal wars and border fights. He had lived because he knew that in the wild, patience was everything. He knew he was the last one alive. The entire attack had taken less than half a minute, but he also knew the man hunting him was no scared runaway with a stolen gun. The timing, the spacing of the shots, the deadly accuracy in near darkness, the discipline. This was a professional, a hunter who had turned the swamp into his own battlefield. Cross held his rifle tight against his chest, pale eyes searching the shadows with a mix of respect and rising fear. With a sick twist in his gut, he realized the truth. The roles had flipped. The hunter had become the hunted. Slowly, he traced the angles of the shots in his mind, following them back through the mist toward the treetops. "Tree sniper," he muttered, up in the oaks, looking down like God. For the first time in his career, Cross felt exposed, watched, measured. He knew that moving even an inch the wrong way would mean death. He was trapped, pinned in mud and darkness, waiting for a mistake that might never come. The swamp grew quiet again, thick and heavy, broken only by dying groans and the soft movement of water. Above, Isaiah remained perfectly still, almost part of the night itself. He knew the last man was dangerous, someone who understood war and terrain. Isaiah could see the edge of the cypress where Cross hid, but he did not have a clear shot at anything vital. A lesser man would have fired anyway, aiming at a leg or trying to force movement. Isaiah waited. He had patience carved into his bones. He knew Cross was listening for any sound, hoping to hear a reload or a shift. But Isaiah moved like smoke. Slowly, carefully, he began to reposition. Staying still against a tracker was death, so he started a careful descent. He tested every branch, spreading his weight, silent as wind through leaves. He was going to finish it on the ground. Cross listened hard, fighting to ignore the pounding of his own blood. Then he heard it, a faint snap, so soft it was almost nothing. It came from the left, away from where he believed the sniper was hiding. A thin smile crossed his face. The enemy was moving, flanking him. Cross believed the balance had changed. By coming down, the sniper had given up the high ground. The fight was now even. He shifted his stance, ready to turn and fire the moment a shape appeared. He thought like a hunter who believes his prey is cornered, forgetting the oldest rule of survival. He did not realize the sound was a trick, placed by someone already far ahead. Isaiah had not gone left. He had slipped silently into the water on the right, sinking until only his face remained above the dark, warm muck. Time stretched painfully. The tension felt crushing. Cross could not stand it any more. He spun around the left side of the tree, rifle raised, ready to kill. The flash would have meant victory, but there was nothing there, just fog and empty air. Confusion froze him for one deadly second. Then he heard it, a soft ripple behind him. Isaiah rose from the swamp like a spirit of vengeance, water streaming from his clothes. At this distance he didn't need a scope. He lifted the rifle and met Cross's eyes. Cross turned fully, terror widening his gaze as he saw death standing 10 feet away. He tried to raise his weapon, but his arms felt heavy and slow. The final shot did not roar. It sounded like a judge's hammer striking wood. Samuel Cross fell backward into the water, his rifle slipping from lifeless hands and sinking into the mud. As the light faded from his eyes, he finally understood the fear he had given to so many others. Cold water closed around him. Darkness followed. The judgment was complete. The swamp claimed him without pause, taking the last intruder into its depths. Isaiah stood over the body for a long moment, breathing hard as the rush slowly drained from his veins, the night closing in once more. Punctuation from his system was replaced by a deep and heavy tiredness. He was drenched, smeared with thick mud, and his shoulder ached hard from the kick of the heavy rifle. Still, he was breathing, and that mattered. Even more important, the family was safe. He worked the bolt one final time, sending the empty casing flying out, where it sizzled softly as it struck the dark water. His eyes swept the quiet ground around him, ears straining for any hint of movement, but nothing came. Slowly the swamp reclaimed its voice. Frogs began croaking once more, and crickets picked up their steady rhythm, as if announcing that the wrongness of the moment had passed. Isaiah turned his back on the ruined clearing and started toward the small, wavering campfire, each step slow and measured. When he came through the mist, he did not look like a beast or a demon, but like an exhausted soldier carrying far more than his own weight. The refugees remained crouched low, locked in fear, unsure whether the approaching steps belonged to a rescuer or another killer. Martha Washington lifted her head little by little, eyes wide, fear shining through them. Her arms wrapped tightly around her children until her hands went pale. She saw a tall, shadowed figure form out of the fog, firelight flashing off the metal of his rifle and catching the firm resolve in his face. "It's over," Isaiah said. His voice was rough from lack of use, but soft enough to cut through the terror holding them still. "You can stand now. They will never hurt you again." Those plain words stayed in the air, heavier than any long speech, filled with a promise they had barely allowed themselves to imagine. Samuel Washington slowly loosened his grip from around his daughter and stared at the man before them. This was no longer the quiet guide who had shared meals and led them through thorn and brush. This was someone shaped by fire and blood. "You killed them?" Samuel asked. his voice barely more than a breath, heavy with shock and respect. "All of them." Isaiah gave a single nod, sharp and practiced. "5 men," he said evenly. "They made their choice. I only walked them to the end of it." He lowered himself near the fire, the glow showing the deep exhaustion carved into his face. Little Thomas peeked from behind his mother's side, eyes wide and shining. "Are you a ghost, Mr. Freeman?" he asked with the simple honesty of a child. Isaiah looked at him, a faint and sad smile touching his mouth. "Sometimes," he answered quietly. "Sometimes you have to be a ghost to keep the living safe." The silence that followed was not broken by more violence, but by distant, steady voices moving with purpose. Isaiah's head snapped up, his hand drifting without thought toward his rifle, though his stance stayed calm. "Hello, the camp." A voice called through the mist, flat and firm with the sound of a Union drill sergeant. "This is Sergeant Mills of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. We heard gunfire. Identify yourselves." Isaiah let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, the tightness finally leaving his shoulders. "Over here," he called back, his voice steady, carrying the authority of someone with nothing left to prove. "Refugees and escort coming in. Area is secure." The Washington family looked at him with confusion, slowly understanding that the man who saved them was not alone, but part of something far greater. Moments later, blue-coated soldiers stepped out of the fog, faces dark and wet with sweat, eyes hard with resolve, bayonets glinting faintly in the firelight. Sergeant Mills, worn by years and loss, gray threading through his hair, entered the clearing with his weapon lowered. He took in everything with a trained glance. The frightened family, the dead lantern floating in the water, the lone guard standing watch. His eyes stopped on Isaiah's rifle, the custom Springfield with its telescopic sight, and recognition spread across his face. "Hold on," Mills said, moving closer, all plain in his voice. "I know that rifle. You're him, aren't you? Freeman, the ghost." The soldiers behind him straightened, murmurs passing through them as understanding rippled across the group. They were standing near a living legend. The man whispered about around campfires from Virginia to Tennessee to keep hope alive. Isaiah shifted slightly, uneasy beneath their stares, far more comfortable in shadow than praise. "I am," he said simply. "But right now I'm just a guide. These folks need food and safe passage to the lines." The soldiers moved quickly then, energy renewed, treating the refugees with a respect usually saved for honored guests. As Martha and Samuel gathered what little they owned, young David tugged gently at Isaiah's mud-stained coat. "Mr. Freeman," the boy asked, wonder filling his voice, "are you really famous? Did you really do all the things they say?" Isaiah knelt again, meeting the boy's eyes, tired yet kind. "I'm just a man who learned to shoot straight," he said, resting a hand on the child's shoulder. "Being famous doesn't matter, being free does. That's the only story worth telling." Martha Washington stepped forward then, tears falling freely, no longer held back. "You saved us," she whispered, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "We will never forget you. My children will know your name, and their children after them." Isaiah nodded, accepting her thanks, which meant more to him than any ribbon or rank ever could. 3 months later, the story of the Georgia swamp had raced through both armies like fire through dry grass. In Union camps, Isaiah Freeman became a sign of justice at work, proof that chains could be turned into weapons. Confederate sentries began seeing the ghost in every shadow, their courage breaking under the fear of a sniper who struck unseen and vanished without trace. Stories grew of a spirit who could fell officers from impossible distances, a force that could not be stopped, yet the true meaning of that night lived far away in a refugee camp in Pennsylvania. There, Rebecca Washington sat inside a rough schoolhouse writing carefully in a journal. She recorded her family's escape so it would never fade. She wrote about fear and mud, but most of all she wrote about the man who stood between them and the dark. "He moved through the trees like smoke," she wrote, "and when his rifle spoke, it sounded like justice itself." The war dragged on through another brutal year, and Isaiah Freeman continued his quiet fight from bell towers, forest lines, and high ridges. He fought at Oost and at Petersburg, his legend growing with every impossible shot. But in quiet moments, when guns rested and stars watched over a wounded nation, his thoughts always returned to that family in the swamp. He understood then that his purpose was not only to destroy an enemy, but to protect what came after. Every time he pulled the trigger, he was not just ending a life. He was buying time for a child to learn words, for a father to earn honest work, for a mother to live without terror. The hunters who entered the swamp that October night believed they ruled it. They forgot the oldest truth of nature. The most dangerous creature alive is the one defending its young. Isaiah Freeman was more than a soldier. He was the guard at the threshold, the watcher in the night, the final answer to oppression. In the end, the tale of the ghost is more than a war story. It is proof of the unbreakable human need to be free. It reminds us that power does not live in whips, chains, or the pride of those who think they own others. Real power lives in steady hands, in brave hearts, and in the refusal to kneel before cruelty. The Georgia swamp has long swallowed the remains of Jeremiah Colt and his men, hiding their greed and hate beneath layers of mud and time. But the name Isaiah Freeman endures, whispered by wind through cypress trees and carried in the hearts of free people. He showed us that when the hunter becomes the hunted, justice is no longer an idea, but a force as real and exact as a bullet. If this story of survival, vengeance, and freedom touched you, do not forget to smash the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We dig into forgotten history to bring forward the legends that shaped our world. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even in the darkest hours, heroes are watching from the shadows. Let us know in the comments which other unsung Civil War heroes deserve their stories told. Until next time, remember this. The most dangerous person in the room is often the one with nothing left to lose and everything worth fighting for. Keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.